So last week I gave you the chronology of the Old Testament with major dates and that, and then I have the outline of Deuteronomy. And so tonight we're going to going through Deuteronomy. Closer to the breakdown that I'll be following this evening is the first outline in your sheet. So if you want to follow along with that, just to keep in mind, what the outlines, they are generalized, and essentially they're just mainly to give you a sense of what's in the book. So they're not by any means exhaustive. You can definitely add on them on your own, and sometimes the division between chapters is a little more refined, but nonetheless they're just meant to sort of give you an overall view of the book and how it fits together and the flow of it and so on. So the outlines that we go through in this time together with lecture will be a little bit more exhaustive and detailed. So if we look on the bottom of our survey chart that I handed out, the big one, 4 major eras that make up the history of the Old Testament. The first era is the era of formation, then the era of theocracy, the era of monarchy, and then the era of restoration. And we are in the era of formation. And we are dealing with, if you will, we've looked back at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. We're going to look at Deuteronomy. And then next week we will move into, if you will, the era of theocracy with Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. And we'll look at Judges and Ruth together, Joshua by itself. So next week we'll look at Joshua, and the week following will be Judges and Ruth, and we'll continue on that way. If you want to turn to Numbers, because we're going to go there, Numbers chapter 33, and then we're going to start walking through Deuteronomy together. And I love Deuteronomy. There's so much here. There's so much that I had to, as I went through and putting things together and then taking things out. There's a lot of stuff I wanted to cover, but we just don't have the time to do. I have to keep reminding myself, survey. So just keep winnowing it down as we go. But we will look back a little bit at the Abrahamic covenant. We need to, because of chapters 29 and 30 of Deuteronomy. We'll talk about the issue of the land, because we're going to have an expounding upon the covenant, if you will, an elaboration for us. But we come to Deuteronomy this evening and remind you this is the title. It's a very valid title. We have the exhortation that comes in Deuteronomy, beware lest you forget. And there is continual reminders that run through Deuteronomy. And if you would like to, I will give you a listing of reminders. If you want to write these down, this is very good. But just generally going through the flow of Deuteronomy, there are several sections that really are highlighted by this overall thought of remembrance. If you would, chapter 4, verses 1 through 43, the remembrance of God's acts of redemption. 6:1 through 25, remember God in the land, redemption. Again, going back to the fact of what God has done, but also looking forward and reminding the nation of Israel just how amazing God is and what He has done for them. And in chapter 6, we'll talk about it. Essentially, there are, besides chapters 29 and 30, there are 3 other chapters that are crucial to the book of Deuteronomy. The first one is chapter 6, the next one is chapter 7, and the third one is chapter 11. And we will look at each one of those this evening and talk about the uniquenesses of those particular chapters. But again, just walking through the book, we see the issue of remembrance. We have in chapter 7, 1 through 26, remember the covenant with God, avoiding idolatry. In chapter 8, verses 1 through 20, remember the manna, avoiding self-sufficiency. In chapter 9, verse 1 through 10, 22, remember rebelliousness, avoiding self-righteousness. God reminds them through Moses just how He selected them out of all the nations of the earth. He chose them, and it wasn't because of anything in and of themselves. It wasn't because they were a mighty nation. It wasn't because they were righteous. It wasn't because of anything other than God's sovereign grace. And that is an overriding theme that we find that permeates all of Scripture from Genesis to Revelation, is the sovereign grace of God. And then in chapter 11, verses 1 through 32, we have remember the condition for knowing God's love, and that is obedience. Obey is a key word that will run through Deuteronomy as well. So just highlighting some of the major movements within this book, and again, this is not, without a doubt, an exhaustive list, but nonetheless, we have these constant reminders of remember, 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 remember. And Moses is bracing them, the second generation, for entering into the promised land, or the land of promise, if you will, the land of Canaan. You know, it's just interesting. I just, for my own soul, going through Deuteronomy, you know, just in stopping and reminding myself, beware lest you forget, remember, remember. It's amazing how Moses is going to reflect on all the ways that God had provided for the nation of Israel. And I just have to stop and just remember how great God is. God is just amazing. I'm never surprised that God provides. I'm just amazed at how He does it. And sometimes I can't even recount how He actually pulls it off. I mean, it's been fascinating to watch over the years in our life together for Les and I. I mean, it goes back to before we were married, but for all the years that we have been married, we've lived with the same focus always. And it's just been interesting to watch and amazing to watch, and so encouraging to see how God is faithful to His word over time. And He always is. You know, sometimes it may be up to the very last minute and you're thinking, God, come on, right? The last minute. And yet He still does, you know. Les and I were talking about, you know, because it's tax time. I'm not going to divulge my life to you. But it was interesting because we were sitting there talking, 2012, have no idea how God got us through the year. No idea. Absolutely none. I know He did it. And if someone asked me, how did you get through the year? I'd say, God, this is no way to explain it. But I can't recount the ways that He did it, you know. But we sit and just look and say, well, here we are. So it's interesting because now we look at 2013. We technically made $4,000 less this year than we did in 2012. I don't know how we got through the year. Just don't have a clue. In one sense, right? I know it's God, but I just can't go back and sit there and recount all the ways that God has done. But it's amazing because if we look at our own lives, just how many ways God just does. And so often we forget to just stop and remember, especially at those moments when it's down to the final moment, right? And we need something to take place and we're waiting, right? And we just forget, right? What God has already done in the past so often. So Moses is going to remind them over and over and over again. And God's going to show His faithfulness. All the way up to the east side of the Jordan River, He is going to provide manna until they get there. Then when it's time for them to cross over, it's going to end. All those years, God had made that provision. So we've seen walking through this journey with the nation of Israel as they wander through the land. And we're going to cover some other territory with them, if you will, as we walk through the book of Deuteronomy, but there's a lot that has brought them to this point. This is a great map. I just found this online. It's a little fuzzy, I'm sorry, but I love it because it just gives us a good sense of the overall terrain and all that happened from Egypt. They come all the way up to Kadesh Barnea. They fail. They're going to be judged. They're going to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And then finally we're going to find them on the east side of the Jordan River across from Jericho, ready and poised to take possession of the land once again. And this time they are going to enter in, although we're going to find failure when they get there. But nonetheless, God is going to get them to the land, if you will. But if you go to Numbers 33 with me, it's we just go back and sort of set the geographical context for us. In Numbers 33:1, the chapter starts off this way. We're not going through the whole chapter, but just sort of, Moses is going to give, if you will, a review of the journey from Egypt all the way up to the Jordan. And starting in Numbers 33:1, it says, "These are the journeys of the sons of Israel by which they came out from the land of Egypt by their armies under leadership of Moses and Aaron. Moses recorded their starting places according to their journeys by the command of the Lord, and these are their journeys according to their starting places." In verse 3, they journeyed from Ramses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month, on the next day after the Passover, the sons of Israel started out boldly in sight of all the Egyptians. While the Egyptians were bearing all their firstborn whom the Lord had struck down among them, the Lord had also executed judgments on their gods. So starting in chapter 33, the first few verses, Moses is going to recount all of the journey, if you will. So if you want to look through that chapter, go back to read through it. He's just going to walk through all the different geographical locations and recount over and over all the places that God had taken them as they journeyed from Egypt to the Jordan. In 33:48 it says, they left the mountains of Abarim and they camped in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. There on the plains of Moab they camped along the Jordan from Beth Jeshimoth to Abel Shittim. And so this is where we are going to find them on the east side of the Jordan. We have Mount Nebo, which we're going to see later on as we go through Deuteronomy, right across from Jericho, poised to take over, if you will, the promised land. They're going to strike to the heart of the land, and then they're going to move to the outskirts, north and south, if you will, as they enter into the promised land. But in chapter 33, verse 50 and following, Moses is going to give them instruction, or God's going to give them instruction via Moses as to what they're supposed to do when they enter into the land. He goes on to say, on the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you. Destroy all their carved images and their cast idols and demolish all their high places. And these would be the places in which they would set up designated spots for worship. It's interesting, when I was with some missionary friends, we were traveling from the border from Mongolia coming back up in through Russia, and we were traveling, and there's this just vast frozen desert is really what it was. And long stretches without seeing another car, people. If you broke down, you're just thinking, man, we're just stuck, we're dead here. But it was interesting because there were these areas where we would stop, and most often very high points where you would be going up through mountain passes. There would be these high points where they would have shamans who would set up places of worship. And oftentimes they would have a little shack built there, and you would find ribbons of cloth in that, and they would write prayers, and then they would wrap it up in these cloths, and they would tie it around this shack, and this is where they would come, and this was, if you will, their high places where they would come and worship. Other places interesting is that they would have near bodies of water. They would find an open area, and you would find these stones put in a circle, and oftentimes it would be a place in which they would come and worship their deities, if you will. So God instructs them, when you come into the land, I want you to destroy all their images, graven images. I want you to demolish all their high places. Verse 53, take possession of the land, settle in it, for I have given you the land to possess. Distribute the land by lot according to your clans. To a larger group, give a larger inheritance. To a smaller group, a smaller one. Whatever falls to them by lot will be theirs, distributed according to your ancestral tribes. So as Moses recounts their journey, then he is going to instruct them as they enter in the land. He continues on in verse 55, but if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land, those you allow to remain will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides, and they will give you trouble in the land where you will live. And then I will do to you what I plan to do to them. We're going to find these exhortations over and over again for the nation of Israel of, I'm giving you this land, you go in and take possession of this land, this is what I want you to do, but understand you need to be faithful to my words and obey my commands. So this is where we find the nation of Israel. They are in the plains of Moab. If you want to turn to Deuteronomy, but this is where we find them sitting. If you will, if we can give an aerial view of the area, we have Mount Nebo, which is in the background. These are the plains of Moab. We have the Jordan River here, which flows into the Dead Sea, moves up north. And so from there, you can have a great purview of the land, if you will, across the Jordan. And again, sitting opposite Jericho, ready to take possession of it. And this is just a little tribute monument on Mount Nebo to Moses himself. Again, just a reminder that we are talking about actual history, right? Actual history. So if we look at Numbers, the breakdown was like this. The generation who came out of Egypt, and then we have the new generation. Transition happens in Numbers chapter 26. We had the preparation that is to come. We had organization, the beginning of Numbers, consecration, instruction, all of this taking place at Mount Sinai as they were prepared, and then they began to move. Then we had the time of testing of faith, testing of obedience, and this was at Kadesh Barnea, where they were to trust in the power of God to be able to take over the land in which they failed to do so, and therefore they had judgment. Thank you for the spell check. And then we had wandering for 40 years, right? Because of, right, due to the days that they were in the land. And then we have the transition that comes, a new generation. We have reorganization, repair, and the plains of Moab. And so now Moses is preparing the new generation to enter in. So essentially we have, if you will, order, disorder, and then reorder. So Deuteronomy, some highlights, if you will, for the book. The book of Deuteronomy complements Numbers, but it doesn't advance the story. And this is why we don't refer to Deuteronomy as being one of the 11 foundational books, because it doesn't move at all. Just like Leviticus, they arrived at Mount Sinai. Everything recorded in Leviticus, they were at a standstill. They were at Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, or Jebel Musa, whichever one you want to use, but they're all the same. But they were at Mount Sinai for that period of time. Well, the same thing with Deuteronomy is that they were on the east side of the Jordan River, not to budge until we have Joshua. Then they're going to enter into the land. There are sermons of this book which are given by Moses and Israel camped in the plains of Moab, and he is preparing, if you will, this new generation before he dies to go in and take possession of the land. But they needed instruction in the law of God, and that is essentially what Deuteronomy is. At the heart of Deuteronomy, we have the instruction from the law of God. And I'll talk about that because really it's interesting. If you take the 10 Commandments, essentially starting in chapter 6 into chapter 26, we have an unfolding of the 10 Commandments. So if you start reading, say, from chapter 6 to chapter 11, it's dealing with the first commandment. And Moses is elaborating on that command. When you get to chapter 12, he's going to deal with the second commandment. Chapter 13, verse 1 through chapter 14, verse 21, he's going to deal with the third commandment, and so on. And he's going to do this from chapter 6 all the way into chapter 26. That's just, as we say in Russian, bezplatno. That's for free. For your own reading in Deuteronomy, and you go back and read through those chapters, just keep that scenario in mind. So essentially, when we'll look at Deuteronomy, it's not a second law given, if you will. It's basically Moses is elaborating on the law that has already been given. And from chapter 6 through 26, we have this elaboration that takes place. So these words of Moses then were needed to remind Israel of several things as they entered into the land. Especially, he's going to build on the past, the history, if you will, looking back to the previous generation. But the main purpose of the book is to remind Israel of their special relationship with God. And he does this in the early chapters. Not only does he historically recount what God has done for them, but he's also going to establish the fact that they have a very unique relationship with God like no other nation has. And again, he's going to remind them that it wasn't because of anything that they have done. It wasn't because they were a great nation. It wasn't because of their righteousness. It was solely by God's sovereign grace that he chose them to be his people. So Moses is going to remind them that they were the covenant people of God and they were to obey his laws, and that they were reminded that they had a privileged position, that they were to serve God in faithfulness and holiness. Now what's interesting is that if you read through the latter chapters of Deuteronomy, God knew they were going to fail. It's interesting. You know, it's the thing. God, nothing ever catches God by surprise. But it's amazing, though, he still faithfully walks through the process with them nonetheless, and he stays faithful to his word. Right? My father was reminding us going through Romans, right? Talking about the fact that the word of God does not fail. It can't fail. It just cannot fail. Moses pled with the Israelites to obey God's commands, and he did so based on several facts. First, based on God's goodness to them in the past in chapter 4, verses 32 through 40. Again, going back to earlier as we were talking, we started into this, it's just reminders, right? Reminding them of all that God has done for them, and so he's going to remind them of God's goodness to them in the past. He's going to remind them as far as God's goodness to them in the recent wilderness experience. How God had provided them as they journeyed, even when they were in a time of punishment, especially for the second generation. They're watching the first generation die off, and they see even God in the midst of all of this still sustaining them and keeping them as a nation. 3, Israel's responsibility to be good testimony to the nations of the earth. And he's going to deal with this in chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. And they were to be seen as a people of wisdom and understanding and so on. But they were to be a light to the rest of the world. I mean, the whole world didn't just consist of the land of Canaan. There were nations outside of that, right? And so essentially God was going to bring them into Canaan, and he was going to establish them as a nation. That was going to be their territory, but they were going to be a light to the world. And people were to be drawn towards Yahweh because of the life that they lived. And the fact that they had such, as Moses reminds them in chapter 4, verse 6 and 7, that they had such an intimate relationship with God. No other nation could claim that their God was an immediate God, an ever-present God. Right? I mean, they worshiped these deities, and they were, if you will, absent deities. So absent they didn't even exist, right? But here was the nation of Israel, had a God who was present with them, who abided in their midst, who resided in the tabernacle in the Shekinah glory. No other nation was like this nation, right? And this is what made them stand out. And Moses says, you need to understand you have a unique privilege, but you also have a responsibility. He reminds them that God's love had been poured out on them in chapter 7, verses 7 through 11. That God's sure promises of blessing in chapter 7, 12 through 14. It's amazing. God says, I'm going to take you into a land. We'll look at this in chapter 7, but I'm going to take you in a land where you don't have to do anything. Houses are already built. Food's already growing. It's flowing with milk and honey. All you got to do is move in. Right? I mean, watch some of these home shows, you know, where they buy and sell property. Listen, I like to watch it at nighttime, our hour together to sort of just defrag a little bit. But, you know, you have people have requests and they're buying a new home. They said, we want a home that we can just move into that's right and ready, right? Turnkey. I want to walk in, have everything ready to go. That's essentially what God did for them. I'm going to bring you into a land and it's ready to go. Just move in. Amazing, God's provision for them. And the sixth is that God's warnings of certain judgment for disobedience. This is important, and it's amazing how dramatic this moment was in the book of Deuteronomy. On either side of the mountain, right, you have the blessings and the cursings, and the people were to acknowledge that they were going to be obedient to the will of God. So the exhortations that Moses gives are based on these things. Deuteronomy, if you will. Everyone get all those? Yeah, I'm covered. So Deuteronomy, some of the key words: observe, do, keep, obey, and remember. These aren't on your outline, so if you want to write them down. A key chapter is chapter 8, exhortation to obey and keep the covenant with God. God forever shows his faithfulness, and they forever show their unfaithfulness to it. Again, take you back to Balaam, right? Well, Balak is trying to get him to curse the nation of Israel. God won't let it happen, and God's protecting them and so on because of his commitment to them by covenant. And yet here they are, if you will, acting immorally. Key verses, chapter 10, verses 12 through 13. Reminder to fear, love, and obey the Lord God. Talk about this issue of fear. I think sometimes we sort of dismiss it as an Old Testament thought, but it isn't. It's affirmed in the New Testament as well, and we'll see that as we go through here. Key characters, Moses and Joshua. We're going to have the passing of the torch. It's amazing. At the end of this section, I'll show you all the different references that we have to Joshua and Moses together. But here we have the passing of the mantle, where now Joshua is going to take over and he's going to lead them in to the promised land, the land of Canaan. And I love the relationship between the two, because essentially what you have is they are both very unique. Right? One, God appears to him in a burning bush as he's a shepherd. The other one, God appears to him as one who is ready for battle, right? Because they had distinct roles, unique roles. And yet at the same time, if you follow the journey of Joshua and Moses together, that they were companions from Joshua's early on in his life. And so you see this relationship of really then Moses pouring into the life of Joshua, preparing him, and then Moses is going to go his way, and the Lord's going to take him, and Joshua's then going to take him on from there. And it's such a great picture of discipleship, even in the Old Testament. And that is essentially what we attempt to do in our life when we disciple others, is that when we are gone, they will carry on. The meaning of Deuteronomy is deuter, which equals second, and nomos, law, second giving the law. Now this is an unfortunate title for the book, because this is based on an improper translation of chapter 17, verse 18. And essentially, Moses is not giving them a second law. He is just recounting the law, or or retelling the law, if you will, or expounding upon it. But that is the title we have anyway for our English translations. The geography is the plains of Moab east of the Jordan River. So again, we have no movement when we come to the book of Deuteronomy. So if you go with me to chapter 1, introduction, some of these things will sort of move through. I know I've got a lot here, so we'll skip through them. It's really hard for me to refine. It's hard to think of certain aspects of God's Word that aren't important that you don't want to tell somebody about. That you want to cover, so you feel like you're sliding or something. But we'll journey through as we go. But introduction, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. This is a great introduction. First, we're introduced to the speaker. We have Moses spoke. We have the recipients, Israel, and where they are across the Jordan in the wilderness, and the Arabah opposite Suf, between Paran, Tafel, Laban, Hazeroth, and if you will, to Zahav. So here's what's interesting is the date that's given. Chapter 1, verses 2 and 4. Start in verse 3, the 40th year, the 11th month. Now this is interesting. We'll go back to verse 2 because I think that there's two things that happen here. First is the date places the revelation of God squarely within history. We're given, if you will, a historical designation for what is happening, not just geographically, but date-wise. This happened in time and space. In a specific time and space, if you will, right? I mean, that's why we refer to as the scriptures as special revelation, given to specific people at specific times, stating specific things about God. General revelation is for all man, and it's very broad. And Robert's going to introduce that to us when he preaches on Psalm 19 for us coming up shortly. The 40th year after the Exodus from Egypt, the years of divine judgment were coming to an end. And so here they are at the end of that period. And again, there wasn't much in numbers about that 40 years of wandering. There aren't a whole lot of details that we are given. We're just given highlights because there's no way that Moses could be exhausted about everything that can go on, but they give us a thumbnail sketch of what happened over those 40 years. And now we find them at the end of those 40 years. Now what's interesting is that we are in, if you will, the 11th month. This is about January, February, about 1405 BC, around the time Moses is going to pass away in this year, right? And this is going to be the end of his life. So this is the final work, if you will, of Moses before he passes. Now it's interesting because when you take this in light of verse 2, it's such a tragic statement that we're given in light of chapter 1, verse 3 and verse 2. The date of verse 3 also establishes a pathetic contrast as a reference to the mention of 11 days in verse 2. And therefore it serves as this ominous reminder of the consequences of disobeying God, because in verse 2 we have this sort of parenthetical, and the NIV does put it in brackets, I believe, and it says, and it is 11 days journey from Horeb by the way of Mount Seir to Kadesh Barnea. Okay? Now this reference to 11 days, just think about this. See, here's the distance. If you go from Mount Horeb, which is talking about Mount Sinai, to Kadesh Barnea, it's about 150 miles. You can travel, Kadesh Barnea being in the southern border, if you will, the promised land, you can travel this route in about 150 miles. You can travel it, if you will, in 11 days by foot, but it took Israel 40 years to make this journey. So not only is he giving us the time frame of what was happening in their life, it's the end of the 40 years, but he also tells us how long it took, right? And what a stark contrast between the two. What could have taken, if you will, just 11 days by foot, took them 40 years to accomplish wandering in the wilderness because of their disobedience. You think about that, right? You know, God wants to get you here, right? And he's going to get you here. Right? But sometimes, right, because of lack of our obedience, sometimes we're just all over this way, and finally he gets us to the point. So here we have, if you will, the land in which we find them, and we find the first sermon that's going to come by Moses, and starting in chapter 1, verse 5 through chapter 4, verse 43. And it begins like this. These are, chapter 1, verse 1, these are the words of Moses. So basically, because of the expression that's given here, it reflects the fact that all of this is really a series of sermons. Some break it up into 3 sermons, 4 sermons, but nonetheless we have a series of strong sermons to these people who are wanderers, and now they are preparing to come in and settle in the land. I give you this quote just as a side thought. But I love the statements. Moses was eminently qualified to speak for God. He was more than Israel's human lawgiver. And I only give you this because this is the end of his life. These are the last messages that we have recorded that he is giving to these people over all of these years. He was more than Israel's human lawgiver. He was the founder of Israel's religion and mediator of the covenant Sinai. He was Israel's first prophet, although God called Abraham a prophet. Israel did not then exist as a nation. Through Moses, God would set a high standard for the people that all subsequent prophets lived under in his shadow, never attaining to it until the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. Most surprisingly, New Testament authors mention Moses more frequently than any other Old Testament person, so Deuteronomy is essentially a series of sermons by the greatest Old Testament prophet. And these are some pretty powerful sermons. They're impromptu, if you will, but there is some structure to them. Like I showed you with the issue of the laws, he recounts the 10 Commandments, elaborates on them from chapter 6 to 26. But also it's set sort of in the form of a treaty, if you will, that was known to exist in those days and how they would communicate between a king and his people. So there is some form to it. It isn't sporadic and what have you, but it is impromptu, and there are 3 strong, powerful messages that Moses gives. So the first one, we have the historical review of God's mighty and gracious acts between Horeb to Beth Peor, starting in chapter 1, verse 5 through 3:29. So 1:5 says this: across the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this law, saying, the Lord your God spoke to us at Horeb, saying, you have stayed long enough at this mountain, so now the journey begins and they're going to depart. So Moses, as he's speaking to the new generation, he prepares them in the promised land. He's going to give them, if you will, a historical sketch. It's not exhaustive, but he's going to highlight and give some main points. But basically, he's going to speak about God's great power and Israel's unbelief and failure. It's interesting. I don't think, that we oftentimes think about this as much as they would have. But for them, family was so important. And it wasn't just immediate family. They were always thinking generations down the line. They were always concerned, not just with their children, but their children's children. And we'll see this recorded over and over in the Old Testament, and especially in chapter 6. Instruct these things, give them to your children and to your children's children, right? To your children and grandchildren, and so on. And they were always looking forward, and they were always tracing their lineage, and they were always concerned with family connection and dynamics and so on. And so it was important for them to remember that they were building on a foundation, but a negative one at that, and looking back at their parents. And it's such a challenge to us as believers as to what kind of, if you will, legacy that we are leaving our children. Are they going to look back and learn from our mistakes? Or are they going to look back and learn from all of our victories as we walked in obedience with God? In this case, he's going to remind them of all of their failures. But he reminded Israel of God's provision as protection. He also reminded them of the way to blessing was through obedience. So we have the introduction that comes in chapter 1, verses 2 through 5. And then he's going to move from Sinai to Kadesh, chapter 1, verse 6 through 146. And Kadesh is also, if you will, or Horeb is also Sinai, and that's why I put that in the brackets. Then he goes from Kadesh to the plains of Moab, 2:1 through 3:29. And this is just to get us, if you will, prepared, the introduction. Then he gives an exhortation to obey and resist idolatry, chapter 1, verses 1 through 43. He gives the purpose of the law, 4:1 through 8. And if you want to turn to chapter 4, because we're going to look at a couple elements there in chapter 4, not exhaustively at the chapter, but just a few things. But he establishes the purpose for the experience at Horeb. And again, we're talking about Mount Sinai. So in chapter 4, verses 9 through 14. This is important because as he's talking about the need for obedience, he reminds them why they had this experience at Horeb and what took place while they were there. Horeb, the term means dryness or desert, and for some it held reference to the lower part of the peak of Sinai, which one would ascend to, if you will, the southern summit of Sinai, which is referred to as Jebel Musa, or the Mount of Moses. Others hold that Horeb referred to the whole, if you will, of the mountain, the whole perimeter, but also including, if you will, that particular summit being Sinai. Whatever it is, however you take it, your guess is as good as mine, but however it is, we understand that Horeb is exactly the same as Mount Sinai. Okay? So when he refers to that, that is what he is talking about. Jebel Musa is the term we use in modern days. You look at a lot of maps, they will have that designation on there. Jebel Musa is just basically the mountain of Moses. So the experience at Horeb was designed to produce the fear of God in the hearts of the people. And Moses is going to remind them of this fact. So God brings them to Sinai after he delivers them out of Egypt. He's going to bring them to Mount Sinai. He's going to, if you will, give them, if you will, the instructions for the tabernacle, but he's also going to give them their constitution, their law. And while they are there, God is going to reveal himself to them on the mount. Now it's interesting, if you go to Exodus chapter 19 and Exodus chapter 20 and you look at both of them, what's fascinating is that chapter 19 you have God's presence coming down on the mount and how the people were to prepare for that. And you have the fire and the smoke coming down and the fear that this was going to bring about in the hearts of the people. And then you have in chapter 20 verses 18 and following again returning to the setting of God's presence on the mount, the fear and the trembling that was there. And in the middle of these two sections, we have the Ten Commandments. Right? The Ten Commandments and essentially being bracketed by this fearful experience of God revealing himself on the mount. Now I had to find this picture because all the other pictures now they're going to the new site for Mount Sinai, which is not the new site, and I explained why. But it's interesting because all the pictures that they show like lava flowing down. There was no lava. There was fire, there was smoke, there was thunder, there was lightning. There's no lava. Okay? So God's presence there, but it was essentially to strike fear in the hearts of the people. And they were to walk with this fear, literally as Moses says in chapter 20 of Exodus, that is to walk with this fear before your face. And so this was to enable them to be obedient to the law of God. So in Deuteronomy 4:9, he's going to remind us of them. He says, only give heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, so that you do not forget the things which your eyes had seen, and they do not depart from your heart all the days of your life, but make them known to your sons and your grandsons. See, generation to generation. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when the Lord said to me, assemble the people to me that I may let them hear my words, so that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children. You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire to the very heart of the heavens, darkness, cloud, thick gloom. Then the Lord spoke to you from the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but you saw no form, only a voice. And so he declared to you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform. That is the 10 Commandments, and he wrote them on 2 tablets of stone. The Lord commanded me at that time to teach you the statutes and judgments, that you might perform them in the land where you are going over to possess it. So the issue is that they needed to have fear, if you will, a proper reverence for God or an awe of God. And I would say that we should at times use the word fear. Because in the Old Testament, we look at fearing God, it was having an awareness of his moral purity. It was having an awareness of omnipotence and afraid to disobey him. And I don't think that we have that kind of fear. We sort of dismiss it almost to the point of respect. But that's not a valid understanding of the term that Moses uses, or even the terms that we find in the New Testament, because I can have a respect for Robert and Brandon, but I don't fear them. I'm not afraid of them, and I'm not afraid if I disobeyed anything they told me to do. But they were supposed to be afraid of disobeying God if they violated his law. And you watch the things that he did, right? Numbers chapter 11, they complained. What happened? Fire came. Complained again, a plague came. Korah rebels. What happened? The earth opened up and swallowed them up. And then later fire's going to come, right? So if you go back to Exodus, you'll find, surrounding that context, the omnipotence of God and his moral purity highlighting that section. But we also understand that fearing God includes worship, service, trust, obedience, and commitment. We're not supposed to run from God in abject terror, but we ought to be afraid of God. Walk in the fear of God. Right? Proverbs says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. In Philippians 2:12, this is not just for the Old Testament. So then, my beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Godly fear stimulates the believer to seek holiness. 2 Corinthians 7:1. Therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all defilement of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. And then godly fear is to be reflected in the believer's attitude toward fellow believers in Ephesians 5:21, and be subject to one another in the fear of Christ. So fear isn't just an Old Testament thing, it's a New Testament thing as well. Not just for the nation of Israel, but for us as the church. But they were to fear God, and this was going to help them to maintain the commands that Moses was giving them. So going back to Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 15 through 24, we have the prohibition against idolatry. And then we have the prediction of dispersion, 4:25 through 31. And I want to look at that because he is going to indicate what is going to happen when they disobey God in the land. They are going to be scattered to the ends of the earth, but God will regather a remnant. In Deuteronomy 4:25 through 31, it says this: after you have had children and grandchildren and have lived in the land a long time, if you then become corrupt and make any kind of idol, doing evil in the eyes of the Lord your God and provoking him to anger, I call heaven and earth as witnesses against you this day that you will quickly perish from the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, and you will not live there long, but will certainly be destroyed. The Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and only a few of you will survive among the nations to which the Lord will drive you. But eventually they will respond in obedience, and God will bring them back. And all of this, he reminds them in verse 31 of chapter 4, for the Lord your God is a merciful God, and he will not abandon or destroy you or forget the covenant with your forefathers, which he confirmed to them by oath. God is always going to be faithful to his covenant. But nonetheless, they were warned. If you do not obey God, then this is going to happen. And so essentially what happens in chapter 4 is we're given sort of a brief outline of the future judgment that is going to come on the nation of Israel. And as we go on, we will see that it actually takes place. First, by the northern 10 tribes being taken to Assyria in captivity in 722 BC. We find this in 2 Kings 17. And then the second, if you will, deportation, it happens in threefold phase. The two southern tribes are being deported to Babylon starting in 605 and ending in 586 BC, 2 Kings 24 and 25. And although there's going to be restoration, we'll see when we get to Ezra and Nehemiah, the last two books of our key foundational 11 books, they never regained the autonomy and dominance. And it's not going to happen until the Messiah comes and establishes the kingdom. So they are still, if you will, under Gentile oppression, right? These are the times of the Gentiles. The only gospel writer to refer to this is Luke, times of the Gentiles. It's interesting, just for your own personal note, if you read some of the other prophets, they always sort of designate to give timeline of their works according to kings of Israel or Judah, right? When you get to Zechariah, it's who? Darius or Darius, if I like to pronounce it, however you want, tomato, tomato. But anyway, but you have Zechariah does it by Darius, right? Now we have a Gentile monarch. Why? He's indicating that the times of the Gentiles have begun. So therefore, there isn't going to be that future restoration until the millennial kingdom comes. And so what we're going to find, what's sort of prefaced here, but we'll see happens and unfolds later, is we're going to have the United Kingdom divided in 931 BC. We're going to have the northern kingdom Israel, southern kingdom Judah. We have the Assyrian captivity take place in 722, and then Babylonian captivity in three phases, 605, 597, and 586. The amazing thing is that the return and restoration will be in three phases as well, Zerubbabel and so on. Then we have the command, if you will, to know that the Lord God is God alone. And I love this. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 35 and 39, he says to them, to you it is shown that you might know that the Lord, he is God. There is no other besides him. Verse 39, know therefore today and take it to your heart that the Lord, he is God in heaven above and on earth below. There is no other. And these are solid reminders they needed to know. They needed to understand these things. They needed to know this because they were going into warfare. They were going to have to go to battle. And although the wives weren't fighting, the children were fighting, but oftentimes their fathers and husbands were going off to war to fight for them as they subdued the land and conquered it. And so therefore they had to remind mindful of the fact that they served the one and only true God. The three Transjordan cities of refuge are an example of obedience, chapter 4, verses 41 through 43. And that moves us into the second sermon of Moses. And the bulk of the book occurs here. So starting in chapter 4, verse 44, notice with me, now this is the law which Moses set before the sons of Israel. These are the testimonies and statutes and the ordinances which Moses spoke to the sons of Israel when they came out from Egypt. And so this is going to begin, if you will, his second sermon. It's going to run all the way into chapter 26, verse 19. And this is, if you will, the bulk of Deuteronomy. We'll walk through this, but there's some key chapters that I wanted to look as we go through here. But first we have the introduction. It comes in chapter 4, verse 44 through verse 49. And then we have basic elements of Israel's relationship with the Lord in 5:1 through 11 through 32, if you will. So we have the 10 Commandments given in 5:1 through 33, and this is why it's interesting. You have this repetition, the 10 Commandments here in chapter 5. Starting in chapter 6, then we have an elaboration on these 10 Commandments. 6 through 11, elaboration on Commandment 1. Chapter 12, elaboration on Commandment 2. 13:1 through 14:21, elaboration on Commandment 3, Iktagdali, and so on. So the total commitment to the Lord, chapter 6, verses 1 through 25. This is one of the three important chapters I want to look at besides 29 and 30 of the covenant. Chapter 6, 1 through 25. This is important, and we should know this, and we probably know it. Who can tell me what is the reference to the passage from here? Chapter 6, Deuteronomy. They call it the what? Shema. Based off of this, hear. That's it. Hear. So they refer to this section as the Shema, and this was crucial to their life. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons. You shall talk of them when you sit down in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they are to be as frontals on your forehead, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Essentially, these things are to be recounted from generation to generation. You are to pass them on to your children, and they should be something that is a part of your conversation from the time you get up to the time you go to bed, to the time you leave your house, to the time you come back to your house, right? I mean, essentially, this is what Moses is saying. And this is crucial because it was essential for the nation of Israel to understand they needed to know the law. This was their constitution. They needed to know the law. And it was the responsibility, if you will, of the priests and Levites to teach the people the law. But it wasn't just the responsibility of the priests and Levites to teach the people the law. It was the parents' responsibility to teach their children. We'll find, I'll give you the reference in Judges, but they actually failed. And there was a generation that grew up not knowing the things of the Lord. And it led to their demise. In Judges chapter 2, we have the cycle of the judges. It's the same for the church. We have those that God has gifted to preach and teach in the church, but that does not abdicate responsibility from the parents to teach their children. Both are necessary. Both are needed. Both are a part of the community life, not only then, but also now. But parents are not to abdicate their responsibility of teaching their children. That's why I love Proverbs, because you see mom and pop right next to each other teaching the kids, right? So the parents were to have a key role in communication of God's truth from generation to generation, chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. Parents were to teach their children to fear the Lord and to love the Lord, and they were to be diligent in this task. They were to prepare them for the future. And see, it's always one generation building into the next. The problem with the Western mindset, it's all about our life right here, right now, and our generation. We're not necessarily thinking about the generation to come. Even when you watch the planning of families these days, right? For non-believers, kids are going to get in the way, right? And so they plan everything because they want to get the most out of their life. And so, well, I can only have one kid. We can handle 2 kids at the most, right? Because they're going to get in the way of our plans for our life. They're not even really thinking down the line. They're not thinking one generation to the next generation to the next generation. And I don't know that necessarily we're always doing that in the church either, but we need to. We are setting foundations for our grandchildren. We are. Later, parents in Israel would violate the instruction, and generations would grow up not knowing the Lord. Judges chapter 2, verse 10. And again, in Judges chapter 2, we have the cycle of the judges. So chapter 6 is a key chapter, total commitment to the Lord. Separation from the gods and other nations, chapter 7, 1 through 26. This is another key chapter. Another vital issue that Israel needed to be instructed on was their relationship to the Canaanites, chapter 7, 1 through 6. So several things that Moses is going to deal with here, and these are critical issues that were given to them. These are important for them to understand. First off, Israel was to destroy utterly and completely every Canaanite in the land, making no treaty of any kind with them. None. They were to wipe out everyone. This was God's judgment on them because they were sinful. Right? All the way back in Genesis, until the time of the sinfulness of the Amorites is filled up, right? And once it's full, God's going to bring the nation of Israel in to take over the land. So God brings them, and they were, if you will, His rod of judgment upon them. So they were to destroy and completely. And everything then in that the geographical boundaries that God had given were under the ban. They were to be destroyed. Now, did they fail in this? Yes. Yes. And they paid for it. They were to make no treaty of any kind. We will find that this also happened. Number two, there was to be no intermarriage with the Canaanites during the several years that it would take to completely conquer the land. Intermarriage would have been a possibility, especially because you had this period of delay as they were subduing the rest of the regions. They had established key major battles and they were won and victory was there, but they still had to finish off the conquering of the land. In that time period, there would have been opportunity to intermarry, and Moses says, you are absolutely not to do this. Right? Intermarriage would bring idolatry with it. Both of these instructions were violated and the results were tragic in Judges. We find this to happen. You see, you intermarry, especially, right, and I'll just say especially with the men, you intermarry with these women who are not a part of the covenant community of God, they're going to lead you astray. And it happened over and over and over again. Yes?
Solomon didn't learn.
Mm-hmm.
Ezra's didn't learn either.
No. So 2 key chapters so far, 6 and 7, as far as preparing them for the conquering of the land, if you will, the land of promise. Chapter 8, 1 through 20, we have a warning against forgetting the Lord. And then we have illustration of Israel's rebellion in the past, 9, 1 through 10, 11. Again, that exhortation to obey, but let me remind you what happened in the past, right? It's like pouring salt in wounds, right? But it was necessary for them to know. And then we have the admonition to fear and love the Lord and obey His will, 10, 12 through 11, 32. Chapter 11 is another key chapter. If you turn there with me, this is interesting because Moses is going to talk about the issue of obedience again. But in this section, Moses also revealed a unique fact about the promised land, 11, 10 through 17. This is a fact that will be referred to again and again by the prophets. This land could not be irrigated like the land of Egypt because the Jordan River was hundreds of feet below sea level. Therefore, it was not a source of water for crops, grazing areas. This land would be totally dependent on the rains. Okay? This was important for them to understand. God promised that if Israel obeyed Him, He would always bring rain for the crops and cattle. If they disobeyed, however, right, then He would withhold the rains and Israel's disobedience to the law, and therefore drought with the eventual famine would reflect the spiritual issue of Israel as a result. So when we find, say, Ruth, right? In the case of Ruth, there was more than likely famine in the land because there was disobedience, and it was during the period of the judges, right? So whenever there was disobedience in land, God withheld the rain, there was drought, there was famine, and that was to remind them that they were spiritually out of whack with the law, that they needed to get right with God. And this was going to be a perpetual reminder for them. So over and over we will find this. So not only is this a key chapter as we come to the issue of the promised land, but it's a key chapter in regards to their life in the land from this point out. If you obey the law, God sends the rain. You have crops, I will provide. You disobey, I withhold the rain. Find this in Joel, Haggai, Jeremiah. So chapter 6, 7, and 11 are key chapters within the second sermon of Moses, and we'll get to the other key ones, 29 and 30, in just a moment. The specific stipulations for life in the new land were given in chapter 12, 1 through 26, 19. We have instructions for life of worship, and this is important because there is going to be, chapter 12, there's going to be one place designated for worship. You go back to Exodus, there were 3 main festivals that they were supposed to go up to celebrate. And so once David had settled in Jerusalem, and that was to be the capital city, and eventually that's where they were going to journey to, the tabernacle, the temple was going to be built there under Solomon. That was going to be the place that they would go to. But there would be that one place designated where God was going to set his name. Anyone know where it was before Jerusalem? What was the singular location when they entered the land? Shiloh. So God is going to instruct them on this particular case. This was for the future in preparation as to when they settled there. This is where God's tent was going to be, one place, one location. Everyone would journey there, and it would be the central place of worship. And again, it's interesting because when we look at their movement as they journeyed, the tabernacle was the heart. When they camped, everyone was camped around it. When they journeyed, it was in the middle of the columns as they headed out. When they came to land, there was going to be a central place, and that was to be the place of worship, and God was always going to be, if you will, at the heart of his people. Geographically, but also spiritually speaking. Then we have instructions for leadership in chapter 16, verse 18 through 18:22. And this is interesting because we have the office of kingship. And this was anticipated by Moses. You go back to Genesis and the giving of the covenant to Abraham in chapter 17. There was the affirmation that kings were going to come from his line. There was an anticipation of the time when the people were going to ask for a ruler. And God was going to give them the kind of king they wanted. Later he was going to give them the kind of king he wanted in David, a man after his own heart. But there was the anticipation of that there was going to be a king, if you will. And so we are given the instructions in chapter 16 and following as to what was to take place with the king. And this was guidelines for the people. Again, when they went into the land, there was the anticipation of theocracy, right? Priests and so on would be the mediators of the law and that, but God still knew what was going to happen and take place long before it ever happened, and God made the preparations for that and gave instructions for that. But if you look at chapter 17, where we're given the instruction in regard to the king, administration of justice, as the NASB titles it, but he is to be from among your countrymen if you're going to select a king. He must not multiply, multiply, multiply. And this is an important repetition that comes up. These are several things that he is not to do if you have a king. He must not acquire many horses. He must not acquire many wives. He must not acquire much silver and gold. And the point is that he must not rely on military strength. He must not rely on political alliances. He must not rely on wealth for his own position and authority. Solomon failed, right? Oops, a big one, right? It's exactly what happened. He must write a copy of the law and read the law, 17, 18, and 19. And his heart must not be lifted up above his countrymen, 17:20. These were the instructions that God gave them in regards to a king, because he knew the day was coming when they were going to ask for one. And again, embedded in the covenant that he made with Abraham all the way back in Genesis. Who's the one well-known king that we know so well, or we should know so well, so young, and yet was committed to the law?
Josiah.
The Ute. Josiah the Ute. Young man. Amazing story. So this was the instruction, chapter 17, as far as leadership goes. The heart of it is in chapter 17. Instructions for societal order, 19:1 through 23:14. Instructions for miscellaneous laws, 23:15 through 25:19. The first fruits and tithes in land, 26:1 through 15. The affirmation of obedience, 26:16 through 19. And then we have the blessings and the cursings of the covenant, 27:1 through 28:68. And then again, such a tangible reminder, such an experience, right? Passing between the mountains, blessings and curses being read. And then we have the third sermon that comes of Moses in 27:1 through 30, 20. And this is important. Go to these chapters because we want to look at, if you will, 29 and 30. And this is where he's going to elaborate on the covenant, if you will. And we had the Abrahamic covenant, and I was going to go back and cover a lot of it, but I decided to weed it down to just this. Basic Abrahamic covenant was this, in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, land, seed, blessing. We just give it this three-part breakdown. So essentially, the Palestinian covenant, which comes in chapter 30, verses 1 through 10, this covers the land aspect. Then when we come to the Davidic covenant, 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 16, we have the seed aspect. And then when we come to the new covenant, Jeremiah 31, 31 through 34, the blessing aspect. And this is what involves all of us. And so this is the first, if you will, in the elaborations on the Abrahamic covenant given in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, is dealing with the issue of the land, a possession of the land. The book of Deuteronomy anticipates the possession of land by Israel, but the people journeyed through the wilderness and came up to the east side of the Jordan River in anticipation of possessing it. This is an important emphasis of the book, since 69 times the writer of Deuteronomy, Moses, repeated the pledge that Israel would one day possess and inherit the land promised to her. So God is fulfilling that promise, right? To make a great nation, you need people, law, and land. We got the first two parts, we need the last part now. So the Lord reiterated the conditional nature of the covenant by citing the necessity of obedience for the blessings, while the citing of judgments for disobedience. But the judgments anticipated the dispersion of Assyria and also to Babylon, and also looks even forward to the destruction of Jerusalem by Titus, when 17,000 Jews, adult Jews, were sent to Egypt to perform hard labor, and those who were under 17 years were publicly sold. All right? So this is looking to the future, where they're going to stay dispersed. I mean, there's going to be that return that comes in Ezra and Nehemiah, but understand that full restoration does not come until the millennial kingdom, till the Messiah comes again. However, when all those calamities were over, God revealed that Israel would once again possess the land, and this is Deuteronomy 31 through 10. This would ultimately be fulfilled in the millennial kingdom. This is important. I mean, understanding this stuff with the covenants is crucial for us, because sometimes there are those in the church who think that the church has completely displaced the nation of Israel. And they begin then to interpret Scripture figuratively, symbolically, instead of literally, and it needs to be interpreted literally. God is still going to restore them. There's still going to be the issue of the land that's going to be settled. God is still going to fulfill that, if you will, in the millennial kingdom. And so we have to keep in mind that we partake of the blessings. Yes, thank you. Jill has the little framework of the little doodad of the covenants. God is going to fulfill that aspect of the covenants, if you will, and He's going to restore them to the land. We partake of the blessings, but understand that that nation of Israel, God is not done with them yet, as we're reminded from Romans chapter 11. So in chapter 30, verses 1 through 3, we have the nation plucked off the land because of unfaithfulness. There will be a compassionate regathering by God accompanying Israel's final redemption in 33 through 6 of chapter 30. There will be a spiritual transformation, chapter 30, verse 6. There will be judgment upon the enemies of Israel, chapter 30, verse 7. And the nation will then receive her full blessing, chapter 30, verse 9. God is going to keep His promises like He always has. He will continue to keep them, and we have to be mindful of that fact. It brings us, if you will, to the transition from Moses to Joshua, 31, 1 through 34, 12. This period is when we're going to have a transition. The interesting thing is that this is not when actually Joshua is established as the recipient of the role of leadership in place of Moses. It happened before this event, but nonetheless there's going to be the transition that takes place. We have the appointing of Joshua in 31, 1 through 8, but again, this is not the first time that this happens. The deposing of the law in 31, 9 through 13, and then we have the Song of Moses in 31, 14 through 32, 37. The anticipation of Israel's failure in chapter 31. See, nothing's going to catch God by surprise. We have the witness of Moses' song. We have the communicating of Moses' song, and then the final events of Moses' life in 32, 48 through 34, 12. We have the directives for Moses' death, the blessing of Moses, and then the death of Moses. And again, a reminder, the whole reason why Moses couldn't enter the promised land was why? struck the walk and did not give God the glory that was due him. Of all that time, right? One thing. And God would not let him enter into the land. But at least he let him see it. At least he had that privilege, right? But we have the passing of the torch between Joshua and Moses, and so next week we'll come and look at the book of Joshua. But Joshua was the attendant of Moses from his youth, Numbers chapter 11, verse 28. Joshua led the victorious battles against the Amalekites. Joshua, the servant of Moses, accompanied the Jewish leader to the mountain of God. Moses changed his name from Hoshea, salvation, to Joshua, the Lord saves, for whatever reason, don't know. Joshua was one of the 12 who spied out the land. Joshua was indwelt by the Spirit. Joshua was first set apart to succeed Moses in Numbers 27. Joshua followed the Lord fully. Joshua was then commissioned in 31:23 of Deuteronomy. Joshua was filled with the spirit of wisdom. He was charged by God, assumed command, and confronted by the captain of the host of the Lord. And this is where we are going to come next week as we look at the book of Joshua. But an amazing transition from one godly man, right, to another godly man. And God is going to use Joshua in a mighty way. So next week, Joshua, prepare. I will come outlines, introduction material, and then week after that, Judges and Ruth we will look at together. So it'll be a little more expedited, if you will. The only main thing we really want to focus on in Judges is the cycle of Judges chapter 2. Any questions?